Well, thank you very much, Julianne, and thank you to the Center and to all the organizers for hosting this wonderful conference. I'm finding it extremely enriching, and you know, it's a privilege to be here, so thank you for inviting me. I'm going to have to give you a little bit of background to the text before I go into the substance of the hermeneutical methodology and cosmology in the text. I say text. In fact, it's a collection of exegetical comments that were ascribed to Jafar al-Sadiq by the Sufis. The work that I've translated, it's found in the compendium that was collected by Abu Abdurrahman Muhammad ibn Hussein al-Sulami, who died in 1021, entitled Haqaiq al-Tafsir. This compendium is sort of the equivalent of Tabari in Sunnism, in as much as Sulami collected together a variety of comments from different early Sufi masters or individual Sufis. They didn't have to be masters. And his stated intention was, in the case of Jafar al-Sadiq, to collect these floating comments and put them to these floating comments that were not organized in any particular order, and he wanted to pen them down. When he put them down in the book, he followed the codical order of the surahs and the verses. But that was not how the exegetical comments were arranged in themselves. They were disparate, atomistic. I expect it was oral teaching and thematically organized by the master and then noted down by the students as it interested them. So if you follow the codical order, there isn't really, you don't get the topical cohesion. So what I've tried to do is to extract from the comments, in this case, the cosmology. It's embedded in there. It's implicit. Some of the terms are explicit. Some of the terms I've put in, which I'll point out to help you understand. And I've put it out like this because there are lots of cross-references and the levels are there. And when I looked at it and I was listening to Muhammad's talk earlier, I thought, well, that's 7 centuries later, and it was very complex and very sophisticated. This is 7 centuries earlier. It's much simpler. It's much, I don't know, it's more nebulous, and yet it's quite complicated still. Anyway, what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to see the seeds of what came later embedded in this text. Going back to what I call the text, what happened was that Father Paul Nuya in our time he extracted the 309 comments from Jafar al-Sadiq from Sulami's compendium, and then he compared the Jafarite comments between several manuscripts of the Haqaiq, and then he produced a critical edition, and that is what I have worked on. And for the sake of brevity, I call it Tafsir Jafar. This is tafsir in the generic sense of the term, exegesis. It's not a classical work written specifically for that purpose. Now, the second half of the title of my talk, the ascription, is also a moot point. Academia is still doesn't feel that the author ascription has been authenticated yet. So the jury's still out on that, but until we can confirm that it wasn't from him, we will just call it Tafsir Jafar. From my point of view, having engaged with the content, I do feel there is an internal thematic and doctrinal coherence that strongly indicates a single speaker for at least many of the comments. There are a couple of comments that are very Sunni in tone, and I'll just say I won't quote all the comments because the time is short and it actually wouldn't do justice to just reel them out, but I'll try and give you some of the comments. But there are a couple which are very Sunni in tone, and many that are very susceptible of strong Shi'i interpretation. So it might be that the 2 Sunni comments are interpolations in a predominantly Jafarite text, a text that comes from Jafar, that was passed to the Sufis who were not technically Shi'i, so perhaps left out certain elements or just noted what interested them. Jafar al-Sadiq had many, many students, all sorts. He had muhaddithun and as well as Sufis. He was also a master of alchemy, And when we look at the way he has, the way the methodology of hermeneutics is interwoven with the cosmology, it is kind of almost alchemical, and you feel, you can taste the energy. Okay, turning to the text, to the substance itself now. Placed early on in the text by the historical transmitters and editors is the famous comment by Jafar al-Sadiq in which 4 levels of meanings within the Qur'an are identified. The comment is as follows. It is related from Jafar ibn Muhammad that he said, "The Book of God has 4 things. Literal expression, ibara, which is here. So I'm going to go upwards. Literal expression, ibara, allusion, ishara, which is the next level, subtleties, lata'if, and the deepest realities, haqa'iq." Shall I use this? Yeah, it might be better. So we have here ibara at the lowest level, then ishara, then latifa, then haqiqa. And he says basically he says that the ibara is for the awam. Ibara is external expression, the awam is the commonalty. So the external expression, the literal expression of the text is for the common man. The ishara, the allusion, is for the elite. The latifa, or the lataif, the subtleties, are for the awliya. The awliya are the friends of God, in other words, the saints. And the haqa'iq are for the anbiya, the prophets. So these 4 categories define the interpretive levels, okay? Expression, outward expression, he says very little on that. The whole text is pitched on the higher levels. In the domain of ibara, you have, in the domain of ishara, allusion, you have 3 subcategories. Jafr, which is letter mysticism or letter association. Tatbiq, which is a system of analogous correspondences whereby everything that in the world, the physical world, is seen to have an archetype or a correspondence, an analog in the higher levels, and higher and higher all the way up. And the third aspect of ishara in the text is ta'wil. Ta'wil, not in this sense of Ismaili ta'wil, as in the whole of esoteric kind of interpretation, but the specific technique of going back to the letters of the words and then through associated verbal meanings coming to a broader interpretation. And we'll see an example of that very quickly. Okay, in addition to these 4 categories defining the interpretive levels, they also define the levels of the cosmology, which will become clearer. But before we go into that, I think it's worthwhile to spend a moment in looking at the Qur'anic designations of the levels of the incarnate person, because it was clearly taken for granted by someone like Jafar al-Sadiq. He expected the students to know the delineation of the human being in the Qur'an. The state of insaniya, incarnate humanity, also known as bashariya in Sufi terminology, is described in about, I'm going to give you 4 places. In Surah 3, verse 59, we have a reference to the dense substance of man's corporeal body. And keep in mind, when we're talking about the awam in the macrocosm, we're talking about the physical body in the microcosm of the individual human. So, going back to the verse, it says, Adam khalaqnahu min turab. Adam, we created him from dust. I will put the him in because the pronoun is there. I was going to leave it out. But dust, turab. So that's the physical body, that's the physical world in the macrocosm. Then you have the subtle parts of the soul. The soul is divided in the Qur'an into three levels. You have the nafs al-amara bis-su, mentioned in Surah 12, verse 53. That's the lower soul. The nafs al-amara bisu means the soul that commands to wrongdoing or orders what is bad. Then you have the nafs al-lawama, mentioned in Surah 25, verse 2, which is the self-censoring, self-rebuking soul. That's also in the tafsir, it's the heroic soul. This is the soul that sees the darknesses within itself and strives to overcome them, that aspect of the soul. Then you have the nafs al-mutma'inna, mentioned in Surah 89, verse 27. And this is the peaceful soul, the soul at peace, the soul that is in harmony with the spirit inside her. So we're talking now about ontological continuity, to be in harmony with the spirit. And then in verses 8 to 9 of Surah 32, reference is made to all of these different component elements in the following. I'll give you the full quote here. He, God, commences the creation of the human from clay. Sometimes the dense matter is referred to as clay, teen, sometimes as torab. They both signify dense material, physical matter. Then God causes man's procreation by means of a lowly water. Then he fashions his form, and breathes into him of his spirit. And he grants to you hearing and eyes and minds. In the spiritual journey of the exegesis, there is an overlapping ascent between these levels of the microcosmic being and between the levels of interpretation. And always in the tafsir, there is a supple interplay between the macrocosm and the microcosm. It's not explicitly stated, and it's so obvious at the same time. So for the students and those who are unfamiliar with Sufi hermeneutics, let me just point out that there is logic in the method of Sufi thought, but the dynamic is not rigid, and it's not rigidly linear. The ascent is often a spiraling circular movement, and you come back to the same point again, but at a higher level or deeper level. There are also interfaces between the two, between the levels, and these are indicated here. These interfaces are overlaps of two domains. They are, in fact, portals of access to either domain. There is another hadith, if want, or khabar from Sayyidina Jafar, which Kristen, you quote in your book, which talks about, and I think Sayyidina Ali also and Ibn Mas'ud have a version of it, where he talks about, or mention is made of every harf having a had, a limit, a zahr, which is an external, the exterior, then the bottom, the interior, the had, which is a limit, and what is often translated as mutala'a. But yeah, mutla'a. I prefer mutla'a, and to me it's actually the point of ascent. This is your had, it's the differentiator between the levels. So there is a discontinuity. But in the mutla'a, the point of ascent, the overlap, the interface, that is where you get the continuity. And I won't go into this in very much detail in this talk, but the actual continuity is purely ontological. So if we talk about the method of realizing in this tafsir, it would be to do with qualities, nothing else. Time and again we come back to that in this tafsir, the qualities. So another thing that you should keep in mind is that in this spiraling ascent or circular ascent, you have a situation whereby the lower or the higher to one lower becomes the lower for the next higher. In metaphysical terms, archetypes of ectypes become ectypes of higher archetypes, and so on and so forth until you come to the absolute archetype, God himself, one and only. Okay. I've already told you that the outward expression, the ibara, the lowest level of interpretation, pertains to the physical body, and then we've gone through all that. I'll just give you that one example of the single kind of comment in the text that comes to mind about ibara, is that Jafar al-Sadiq said, when commenting on Surah 731, which is خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ, don your adornment at every place of worship, Jafar said, keep the members of your body, the limbs, away from contact with anything after God has made them an instrument wherewith the religious obligations that He has ordained are fulfilled. The adornment is the state of ritual purity, and the advice is to avoid those things that would nullify the ritual ablution. That's just about the only thing I could find on Ibarah there. So, but Ibarah interfaces with a level of ishara, of allusion. Access to the subtle is through the literal. And this is the initial area where the transition between dense matter and the subtle realm is effected by means of symbolic allusion. For example, through the hermeneutical tool of ta'wil, the commentary discusses the Meccan mountains of Safa and Marwa as symbols, respectively, of the spirit and the heroic soul. Safa and Marwa. So Marwa is down here, the heroic soul. The comment states that it is related from Jafar ibn Muhammad that he said, Safa is the spirit because of its being pure, لِصَفَائِهِ, pure of the dirt of oppositions to God. And Marwa is the soul because of its use of the heroic virtues, muruwa, in the performance of services for its master. Safa is the commentarial reference to the individuated spirit. And Marwa, because of its valorous heroic service, its muruwa, is the heroic soul. Now, you will note that what Jafar al-Sadiq has done, he's gone back to his ta'wil has taken him back to the verbal roots of Safa and Marwa, and then he provides this broader interpretation based on associated verbal meanings. Muruwa means chivalry, Marwa, the name of the mountain. Saqar falls into the same category, doesn't it? On the other end. So, through a single comment, we have transited from the outward physical domain to the subtle realm through the portal of Ishara. We've gone from the common man, your outward body, to the elite hero, the self-rebuking soul that is engaged in the spiritual struggle of overcoming the nafs al-amara bisu, the soul that commands the wrongdoing. For the next step, allusion interfaces with subtlety. So Ishara interfaces with Latifa. This happens when, as we're told in the commentary, the soul has been divested of all opposition to God's qualities. On Surah 3:76, which the Quranic phrase is Bala man awfa bi'ahdihi wattaqa fa inna Allaha yuhibbul muttaqin. Rather, the one who fulfills his pledge. Now, this commentary, I should say, it will just take maybe a word or a phrase, and then using that phrase just plunge straight in, and it doesn't really contextualize the comments in the Quranic context. Not always, it does sometimes. But on this now, the fulfilling of the ahd, and of course we're thinking of Joseph here, this is a reference to the primordial covenant. Jafar said, this is a reference to him who fulfills the pledge that fell to him in the first covenant, who fulfills the ahd that fell to him in the first mithaq, and who is God-aware and purifies that pledge and that covenant from its being polluted with falsehood. The fulfillment of the pledge is being with God by excising that which is other than him. So basically, the heroic soul is combating whatever is not in harmony with the divine qualities that are in you, present in you, in your spirit. So Safa's presence there is actually transmitting the divine qualities to the soul. And the soul, nafs al-amara bisu, produces dirt in opposition. That is so that if, for example, instead of mercy, it acts in a way that is harsh and harmful, it throws up a veil of dust. He actually refers to the mukhalafa, to this opposition, as a dust. So the heroic soul then, Marwa, is striving to either not even allow the dust to arise on the soul or to cleanse the soul, so that this dust does not block the radiation of the divine qualities through the soul. So, maybe I should just say on the end of that verse is, for verily God loves the God aware. That's how I prefer to translate the word taqwa, which is sometimes referred to as God wariness. Because what is it to be wary of God? It's not just the kind of awe and fear and reverence, it's to be aware of Him at every moment, at every instant. That awareness is there. So that's taqwa, because you're thinking, I'm aware that God is watching me at every moment. And that's the kind of, I think that captures it. So although it's not an absolutely literal translation, I think it conveys the meaning quite truthfully. Now, elsewhere in the Tafsir Jafar, it is made clear that God awareness is foremostly an existential state. It's not just your mental awareness. It is what I've said earlier, it is for the person to allow the divine qualities to extend in and through the soul. One of the comments Jafar makes is on Surah 8, verse 17, وَلِيُبْلِيَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ مِنْهُ بَلَاءً حَسَنًا, and that He